Okay, thanks everyone for joining in another of our webinar series. This topic is actually something we haven't talked about specifically before, and this is about the skill profiles or the resource profiles as you can define them in the OpenAir system. As we go through, I'm going to show you some examples of what other customers are doing in the system, and we'll go into the system. I have a sandbox that I've configured, some typical things and some silly things just to kind of show you what's worthwhile and what's not worthwhile. If you haven't been to one of our webinars before, the way that these work is I mute the phone line so we can get through the materials, and then I leave time at the end for questions. So I'll unmute the lines. Anyone can ask questions on this webinar or any general questions you have about previous webinars, our weekly tips, and so forth. And then we'll close out the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. The agenda that we're going to cover is why do you want to use profiles to begin with in OpenAir? And people commonly call them skill profiles, but it could be anything in the profile area of the resource module. And what should you be tracking as far as a profile? What's worthwhile to track as a profile? And of course, how to actually set up the profile database. It's a sort of a four-step hook, connect the dots type process to set up the profile database. But once it's there, it'll be pretty valuable if you can keep everything up to date. Where can you use the data once the resource profiles are set? Where in reporting and lookups and stuff like that. And of course, how can you best keep these profiles up to date, which is always something that's extremely tricky when people tackle this subject. And then we'll summarize what we've discussed. So why use profiles in OpenAir? The real term for the profile is resource profiles, but I know I am guilty of it, and it's commonly used by most customers as a skill profile. But it doesn't have to be limited to skill sets. The reason that people use this is that they want to be able to have a central location that allows the skill sets of individuals or the abilities of individuals to be tracked within the business that support the needs of the business. It allows people from a global perspective to know what resource skill sets are available in other offices or departments or countries that may not be necessarily known because you haven't worked with those individuals before. The alternate way is you can look at it as a way to assist with performance management and career path development. But the caution with this type of use in the profile for OpenAir is that OpenAir is not an official HR profile management education, training, certification tracker type system. It's got a very basic structure to it, so as long as the basics are what you need to understand if something's current or not, or missing or not, then the OpenAir profile would be sufficient. But if you're really looking for alerts and notifications and tracking when the expiration courses expire, certifications expire, OpenAir is not great for that sort of secondary, third, fourth level index into profile management, and you'll see that as we get into some examples here. The reason that I'm emphasizing that people call it skill profile, but it can be much more. You can actually track things other than skills, things like what certifications are used by held by your organization. What are the travel preferences that people have, that they can travel internationally or they prefer to travel within the U.S., for example. It could be things like, would you be willing to relocate type things, yes or no type preferences. So it can also be used as more of a wish list type thing if you want to think of it that way. What is good to track? What I typically see in what OpenAir system comes natively configured with is some basic structure around a skill list, an industry list, maybe job roles that you've had in the past, education, soft skills I see people track a lot, languages I see people track a lot. And in looking at things, there's always the skill database, perfect wish list. I need to know, for example, soft skills. I see people tracking that quite a bit. As far as presentation skills is a great example. So if you track presentation skills as a soft skill, how do you know if someone's an expert at that or not? Because everyone can do it, it's just some people do it better than others. So do you have the I do it better descriptor, or just that they have done presentations in the past? So So there's some things that logically seem like they should be good to track, but then how do you actually get value out of that, information? Things like job role experience, I see people tracking, what kind of roles have you held in teams before, team lead. And the thought is always, if I knew people were a team lead before, then I maybe feel comfortable putting them as a project manager. But that could be a wide range of roles that you track in the organization, and do you really ever need to look that up, information-wise? So I'll be asking questions like that as we go through, so it gets you thinking about what's valuable, what's not valuable. When you come to things like skills, it could be broken down into things like products, systems, coding abilities. It could be broken down into different categories. So the example I have on the slide here is, what product experience do you have? Well, there's a lot of products in the world, especially if you're talking in terms of software, hardware. So you can maybe group those by what kind of database products are you familiar with, software systems, software languages, hardware, so forth and so on. So it's good to track things by category. You may want to look at the categories to see how you can break those down into different pieces. But one thing that I run into with customers quite often are some pitfalls on how detailed you want to track things. One pitfall that is pretty popular out there is I only need to track products by version. Whether version, IE7 or IE8 or IE9, I'm going to track to see which of those you know. And sometimes that actually is very hard to maintain, very hard to keep up to date, simply because vendors produce multiple versions all the time. And unless it's a significant change, like going from Windows 3 to Windows 95, that's a huge change. And knowing how to use those two different products, it may be worthwhile to track sort of a general category of pre-95 and post-95, for Windows. I know in my experience with working with the reporting tool Cognos, when version 8 came out, version 8 was very, very different, and you had to find people that specifically were trained on version 8. So that could be a legitimate. You have Cognos experience before version 8 and then after version 8 type thing. Tracking versions is dangerous when it comes to things like QuickBooks, for example. Version 8. Well, do you know version 8, 8.1, 8.7, 8.12.3? And version 9, what's the big difference between version 8 and version 9? So if people start going down that path of, wanting to track version numbers, I generally recommend them steering away from that unless there's a specific reason why the versions are so different that you have to understand if people have experience between the two versions of a product. The other pitfall I see is people that are wanting to be very complete, comprehensive in the list of things that you would track in business. And I have a great example in our database, tracking things that are not necessary for you to track. I need to know what kind of database skills you have, okay? So I'm going to just get a whole list of all the databases in the world, and I'm going to put them in my skill database. Well, I don't know when the last time somebody may have used DB2, for example, but if your business doesn't deal with anyone that does DB2, then do you really need to track that as a skill in your list of categories? And it becomes more important as you identify how complete you want people to put your skills in. So I'll talk about that in the next couple slides. But don't add things to your skill database for the sake of adding things to your skill database. Less is more, usually. What's important for you to search on. And that's sort of a hard decision, but typically if you're responding to a proposal or you're looking at an opportunity and you need to know if somebody has healthcare experience, then that's something that you would want to track is what are the industry experience, the terminology experience people have. If you're a software development company and everyone writes in Perl and knows the Linux environment, then don't track stuff that everyone has to be hired in with a basic knowledge of. And I'll show you an example in my system of this. The other thing that I see, and this kind of goes to that presentation skills example, is tracking things that you should, as a professional, already be able to do. maybe tracking whether you need some certification in it or something is worthwhile, but that's where I come to the soft skills. I always want, I always get a feeling that people want to track, can you do project management or not? It's not a matter of whether you can do it, it's whether you can do it well. So do you put that in the skill database to track, yeah, you can do project management, but not very well. You never would put that, you never really want to put that kind of information in a profile. Everyone can do presentations, just some do better than others. So it's sort of a hard on the whole soft skills area, or just what you should do what you should be tracking as a professional. It's just as part of your everyday job that you should know how to do. Whether you're proficient in Excel, great, that's the thing that you can track. Whether you know how to use a laptop, probably something that everyone should already know in that business, and you don't necessarily have to track that. So sort of bringing out your big spreadsheet and being comprehensive, think in terms of what's really necessary, and would you ever look up to see who's really bad at presentations, So those are the things that I kind of tell people to avoid as far as pitfalls, because now you're tracking too much, and too much is too much for the OpenAir profiles, because it's very hard to keep those up to date if there's too much information to enter in the profile. Some items that I've run into over time that I think are decent ones to track in the various customers that I've worked with. Product experience or the skill list. I would actually not necessarily call things a skill. I would break it down by type of skill. If it's software product, if it's, my phone just rang, so I want to make sure that I can see just the invoice numbers. Oh, hang on. Let me answer this chat real quick so I can make sure everyone has the passcodes. Island is 8670. Sorry about that. So the product experience, in dealing with software companies, usually it's a breakdown of databases, languages, hardware, operating systems, things like that. In my business, it's typically software systems that we have experience with: OpenAir, QuickArrow, or used to be QuickArrow, Financial Force, QuickBooks, things like that. Those are things that usually require you need to know when you're looking up people and looking up their profiles. You need to know if people have experience with Cognos, for example, as a product. You need to know people who are well-versed in Google Apps. So those are the kind of things that would be worthwhile to track as far as product experience or skills, if you want to call it that. I also like industry experience, because quite often I run into organizations, even like things like the creative agencies or software development agencies. They usually are dealing with customers of a certain type of industry. And there's very specific terminology in some of those industries. If you talk to somebody who's running a healthcare organization and then talk to someone who's running a financial industry, like an investment firm, they're going to use different jargon and different terminology, and being able to understand when they say the word book, what does that mean to you? I know typically when I'm talking with people about OpenAir and the term booking, it depends on who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to a finance person, booking means, booking revenue in accounting. If I'm talking to a salesperson, it's booking an order that was just signed. If I'm talking to someone who's doing scheduling, I'm booking a resource to work on a project. So the term book has a lot of different meanings, and I need to know who my audience is. And if you're talking to specific industries, the healthcare jargon is very different than financial jargon, which is very different, again, from government jargon. So it's very useful, I think, to actually track industry experience. Languages, let me check and make sure you guys can still see everything. Okay. Languages, I think, are very important, especially if you deal with international customers. Everyone usually has some kind of English fluency. In the United States, it's definitely you are fluent in English. But, Spanish is often a need in the U.S. Or French if you're dealing with Canadians in the Quebec region. If you're dealing with, Europe and the Far East, there's a whole plethora of languages that you have to have access to, because you're not guaranteed that everyone can speak English fluently or can read and write English fluently. So tracking the languages that are available within your resource team is actually pretty valuable information to have should you run into situations where you need to have that language experience. Location. I like tracking location as part of the profile and not necessarily like a user location or a drop-down on the user record, because you can use the location in part of the search criteria, and we'll talk about that, how you can use these things later in the system. The location value of those, everything in a profile has to have a drop-down or a selection list. It's a bit tricky when you're dealing with global companies because there's tons and tons and tons of countries and cities and all that kind of stuff. So coming up with a manageable list of where are you located is the hard part. And usually country level is good unless the country is very large, like the U.S. So you start having to break it down by state so that you understand geography-wise where people are. Or maybe it's just regions. I'm in Northern Europe. I'm in Southern Europe. I'm in Northeast U.S. Things like that. Okay. But I find that's good because as you're looking up people based on their skill sets, you also want to do a double check to see, well, where the heck are they in the world type thing. And when you do that, then it may be something that might be cost prohibitive to use them even though they have the right skill set. Could you conference them in, so forth and so on. And the last item is visa and passport, especially if you're an organization where there's lots of travel internationally. Knowing who has a passport, how current the passport is, and what visas they may already hold to be able to enter into other countries. Of course, along with this, if you are involved in government work, you may want to track certain clearances people have. If you are in some kind of securities work or software development where you want to track certifications and see how current those are, those would all be valid items to track in OpenAir. But some of those certifications require you to have sort of an annual renewal activity and reminders and stuff, and that is not something available in OpenAir. So if you have another sort of training, tracking, education system, you may want to use that instead. Okay. So these are the ones that I find are helpful in the system setup. But then how much do you put into your database? How much do you set up in your database? And then how do you describe or require people to set up things in their database? And what I mean by that is if I have a list of 150 skills, am I going to require you to enter all 150 and then you give me your level of expertise, which could be none, zero, zip, no experience? Or do I only have you pick the ones from the 150 that apply to you in some level of experience like beginner, intermediate, novice, or 2 years, 5 years, 6 years of experience type thing? I would argue that it's almost better to do the exceptions than in a whole comprehensive thing, but there's pros and cons in both. If you have everyone select everything and put 0 to 5 level of experience or number of years, then everyone's profile is complete. If you let people sort of do a subset, then you're up to the person who's submitting that to identify the skill sets that they actually want to call attention to in the system. So it's really personal preference. If you have a small database, a small number of items, it probably is worthwhile to have everyone complete every single value and then put nulls or empties or no experience as a descriptor. If you have 150 skills to pick from, that's really going to be painful to set up if you have to pick all 150 and you only have skills in like 2. So I would sort of assess what you're putting into the database as to what kind of descriptors or what they call attributes are in the system to drive the way that data is entered in the system. Okay. Another thing, if you say that I have experience with OpenAir, I'm not saying NetSuite OpenAir, there's lots of levels of experience, and all of you guys know that, otherwise you wouldn't be dialing into this webinar. So, do you have people put an indicator saying I'm an expert, I'm a novice, or a beginner, I'm an intermediate, or do you have them say this is the number of years I had experience? again, this is really kind of hard to decide which way to go. I think of terms like subjective terms where it says I'm an expert, I'm an intermediate, I'm a novice. That's very good information for someone who's doing a lookup of your profile and who's trying to understand, I want the top crop, I want somebody who's got enough information to get by, that kind of stuff. So the subjective terms are much more understandable. However, somebody can call themselves an expert, but if you ask someone else about them, they'll say, well, they're sort of, an intermediate. They don't really know everything about the system. So the subjective expert, novice, beginner, intermediate values really drive sort of some kind of review, some kind of, agreement. A manager reviews it or HR reviews it or there's a peer review, something to validate that if they pick expert, they actually are an expert. Versus just saying they're an expert and then getting in trouble if you put them on an engagement where you find out they're not actually an expert. So what about using things like, objective values? Objective values means how many years of experience have you had with this product, okay? Again, that's a double-edged sword. It sounds like it would be the easier answer to go. Yes, I've had 7 years experience with OpenAir, but if you're only entering timesheet data in OpenAir, that's a very different level of experience than if you were an administrator for 7 years in a system for 3 different companies. So the number of years of experience I think is good for things like specific products where you have you always have a role. Like if you say OpenAir administration and you say 1 to 2 years of experience, that is much more descriptive than just saying using the OpenAir system 1 to 2 years. So objective values would have to marry up with the correct type of skill entry in order to be interpreted correctly. Okay. So I'm going to go through how to set up a profile database if you've never seen this. But what I'm going to do is first I'm going to show you just an example database that I have set up in my sandbox. And I do use subjective terms like expert, novice, intermediate, because my team, I know my team, and I can analyze and see if that's a correct assessment or not and make those adjustments if necessary. Larger organizations, of course, there's much more management levels that would have to be involved in the review. And in order for global consistency, you'd want to set some definitions of what does it take to be an expert. You have to have this many years of experience. You have to have implemented the product this many times or talked with this many customers. So there would be some kind of criteria related to the setup of the profile when people are selecting certain values. So in my sandbox, over in the Resources module, these profiles actually live under the Resources tab here. And for many of you, when you go into the Resources module, you default into this Resources tab. And you'll come in here to use it for bookings or allocations or whatever you've renamed this feature. But if you just look at the list of resources here, if you pick anyone's name, you can actually display their profile. And their profile can be entered one of 2 ways. You can do it the old school way, like I'm comfortable with, which is where you pick the actual item that you want to select, and then you fill out the little form that they have here. Or, or you select something called the worksheet, and the worksheet gives you more of a kind of a grid view, an Excel view, where you can pull things down and enter values that way. So it's really, and again, the data shows the same way, just as if you're dealing with expense reports in the worksheet, the expense grid, or you're dealing with the bookings in the booking worksheet. It's the same concept. The data is just displayed in a different format for you to use. And I actually renamed a bunch of stuff here, so let me just log back in here real quick. So as I have these skill-based databases set up, you can take a look at them, and you can see the different categories that we have and the values that were picked. And specifically in this system, I'm tracking people's expertise in certain systems that TopStep deals with, things like, of course, NetSuite, OpenAir, SAP, Microsoft CRM, NetSuite itself, the CRM products, so forth and so on, what languages people are proficient in, whether somebody has a current passport, and if so, is it expired, if they have visas and what countries they hold visas for, what industries that they've worked with so far as part of Top Step or outside of Top Step. I actually have a user status profile where I can quickly understand if the person I'm looking up is a contractor or an employee. So I use this actually when it comes to doing the search to give me more information as I'm looking up people, and you'll sort of see why when I have this when we show demonstrations of it a little bit later. And then I put a silly one in there like the favorite word. You know, I did that. What's your favorite word in the team? And I can track that. But that's something that nobody would look it up. But OpenAir is not going to stop you from putting silly things in the system. So if I was never going to search on this, I probably would not have this as a profile element. But it's, you know, it's one of those fun things that you can do. So to track a profile, there's actually two different parts to a profile database in OpenAir. One is the profile categories in the system. So like that first drop-down I showed you, systems and industries and passports and visas, those are profile categories I'm calling. And then each of those categories could also have an attribute set, so there's a descriptor that goes with them. You know, for languages I have level of fluency. For profile categories such as product I have experience. So those two together make up the two-dimensional view of a profile database in OpenAir. To actually create the database, you need to follow 4 steps. And it can be a bit overwhelming, but once you step through this 4-step process, it may make a little bit more sense. So let's step through it. So I've got these detailed in the slides. So the first step is actually to activate a profile category. And to do that, if you are in the administration module, you go to Administration, Application Settings, Resource Settings, and then you click on something called Resource Profiles. If you are not using the Administration module, you want to go to the Resources module and click on the Options tab, and then under the Options tab, you will have the Resource Profiles sub-tab to pick up. So you'll get the same exact form, just different navigation. So once you have this turned on, then it looks like this huge grid of stuff, and there's up to 35 different categories that you can define. If you're defining 35 categories, you're typically putting way too much in your profile database unless you're an extremely huge company and you have lots and lots of detail that you have to track. I'm typically used to seeing people go as high as 8 categories maybe, you know, or about 4 or 5 are actually quite common, just tracking the necessity of what you need in the organization. So to actually activate a category, you check the active box on the far left. OpenAir does give you some standard terminology. They have standard profile types, including skill, education, location, and job role. But when you activate those, you can rename it immediately. So I've changed skill into systems by actually putting the word in the terminology. And then just so that you don't get annoyed with the fact that you always want things to say systems, you can check a box that says do not pluralize, because what OpenAir will do is if it sees the word systems, it'll put an ES on the end to make it plural when you're doing some searches. So it says systems is. So if you have something that is already plural, just check the box there to make sure that OpenAir doesn't try to make it more plural, if that's possible. And then also, if there's a specific way that you've had to type in this term, because OpenAir is going to treat this as a proper noun, capital letter on the first letter, and then lowercase the rest of it. But if you had something like e-certifications and the E is a lowercase, you could check this preserved case, and it would keep the e-certs with lowercase e, uppercase C, versus converting it into, the typical capitalize the first letter of a proper noun. The second half of when you turn on the category is identifying, can you pick more than one of these? So things like the skill list or the product list or the systems list, of course you're expecting to actually have experience in more than one system, more than one product. So you would want them to be able to have more than one value as you select it. If you check the limit 1 per person, What that typically means is like my user status. You can either be an employee or a contractor. You can't be both. So I would check this box to say you can only pick one value and that's it along here. Okay. Another option is to allow duplicates per resource. And what that means is you'll see the way that I have the passport set up is I have U.S. because I'm a U.S.-based company, and then I have other. Well, you could, if you happen to have more than one passport from other countries based on your, your relocation situation, I'd like to know what other passports you may have. So I allow people to pick more than one instance of the word other so that you can identify those other countries. So if I show you an example of that, so I'm going to say, this person, Robert August, has another, it's expired, but it was for Brazil. Okay. And then I'll say, but they also had, they happen to have one because they also came from Mexico. Okay. And that one's also expired. Okay. So based on the fact that I'm allowing more than one of these same entries to be used, I'm allowing sort of an other category or a, select this if, and I can use that same value more than once to add comments and make it unique because I'm explaining why I'm doing other stuff. The show only in-use attributes if you have sort of an uploaded database and there's 17 values in a drop-down list. It's 0 to 10 expertise. 10 is the best. 9 is not so good, not as good, but great. 8 is good, but better than 7 good. Things like that. If people are only picking 10, 5, and 1, then you can actually just have, as people go to create their own profile, the values 10, 5, and 1. I don't really see a usefulness for that checkbox, so I always leave it off because if you put the list in there, you want everyone to use the list as it stands. And then a nice thing is, especially when it comes to maintenance, let's say when I used to work for previous companies, XML became the big thing, and suddenly XML was a skill that everyone had to have. And so XML, of course, was added to the profiles to the list of categories that people could have skill sets in. But then nobody remembered to go back and fix their profile. So if you check the box to say notify everyone when there's a new skill in the database, then they will have at least a simple reminder, and this is the only reminder that we can really do in OpenAir, to go and say, oh, well, XML is there now, so I should go update my profile and indicate whether I have XML experience or not. So once you have activated the categories, okay, so once you have this active and you've determined what the name of it's going to be and if they can pick more than one value or just one value, now you actually have to populate those categories. So just because I said I want systems, OpenAir has no clue what systems I want to put in. So under, again, application settings, resource settings, you're going to get a list of the different profile categories that you activated, and you have to populate those with values. So in the right-hand side here, you see just a small subset of the industries I have. When I click on industries, it gives me the list that I've already created, and if I don't want to add more, you just pick new, add a name, and keep going. So I'm going to go back to my configuration, application settings, resource settings, other. Oops, not other. Let's see, like languages. Okay. So here are the languages I've put in. Let's say, oh, you know what? I really need to keep track of Japanese. So I just add that to the list, and now it's something that everyone can pick about. And if I've checked the box to notify people when a new language is in, they'll get an email saying, Japanese is now available in the drop-down. Okay. As far as navigation is concerned, if you are not using the administration module, when you activate profile elements, they'll actually show up under Account. And if you are in the Account module, the Account tab, in the resource area, you will see all of the active profile elements show up there, as well as attribute sets. So step 3 actually is attribute set. So if you decide that you want to add a descriptor or further refinement of the selection, if someone says, I'm experienced in DB2, then you may actually want to know how experienced are you, or what's your level of expertise, or how many years have you worked on this, something like that. So some common attributes that I usually see people set up are something like years of experience or expertise. When you're dealing with languages, you really want to understand fluency. I've flirted with German for probably a good 20 years of my life. I'm still not fluent because I haven't been driven to have a need to be fluent at this point, even though I would love to be. And then things like passports, there's no experience with passports, but there's more of a current expired type flag in the system. I will tell you that a request and a desire from the user community about these profiles is to be able to, in this attribute drop-down set or some kind of attribute set, is the desire to have a date be applied versus a drop-down list. Things like, saying, do you have a passport, and being able to put the date in a field right next to it that you could search on has been something that's always coming up when people look at profile elements. Unfortunately, you are limited to just drop-down values. So some workarounds are, well, let's just populate the drop-down with month, year for everything, or use this sort of current expired and then add the notes field so that you can keep track of when the expiration date is going to be. And that's the example I have set up in my system. Okay. So the attributes are in the resource settings area, or for those of you who would be on the account module, account tab. And you really just set up they sort of stand alone. Okay, what are the possible descriptors? Ability, fluent, limited fluency. You can kind of understand that I'm going to attach that to the language, and that's exactly what you do in step 4. So step 4, you go back to that massive resource profile sheet, and then you just add that last piece here, which is the attribute set piece. And if you don't want an attribute, you don't need to have one. Just leave it as is. My user status does not have an attribute. Either you're an employee or you're not. I don't need to know whether you're an expert employee or a novice employee. I just know that you're an employee. There is another category here called related profile, and what it does is if you tie profiles together, the rule controls that you have as far as limiting one value or allowing duplicates, it really is more of an either or. So if you say you're only allowing one value for this entry, if you pick it for visa, you won't be allowed to pick it for passport. So I haven't seen a need to sort of do this. You either pick one or the other value in the system, but it is possible with this related profile element. So now you've got your profile set up. You've trained your people on how to enter it by going into their resource profile and building it out by putting it in the worksheet or putting one by one. And now, the minute that the last person hits save, tomorrow everything's out of date. So how do you keep it up to date? What's the best way to keep it up to date? The unfortunate thing is OpenAir does not provide those reminders and alerts like it does on late timesheets or scheduling a report or anything. So the best thing you can do is there is an advanced report in the system, and at the very bottom left on the advanced reports, there's something called resource profiles. And what the resource profile report does is give you a person, the profile category, and the last time it was updated. So it's sort of more of an audit approach to understanding whether something's current or not. So if I go to the Reports module, the Advanced tab, and I scroll down to Resource Profiles, just like a lot of the advanced reports, you can't really control a lot of what's going to happen with this report. It's a standard report that comes with OpenAir. But I can control a little bit of the layout. Who is it? What's the element that I want? What's the value and then the attribute that I want? And when was the last time it was updated? Okay, that's about all the information I can get. And then I can actually limit that based on, a resource filter or the different profile elements that I have in here. When's the last time people updated their systems area? Give me everyone in their systems area and make sure that everything's been updated. Okay. When I run the report, it comes back with literally just a data dump of when was the last time this was updated. Okay. Recently I had a customer ask me, I'd like to run a report that tells me all the resource profiles that are missing an entry for, category X. Okay. Unfortunately, there wasn't a way to do that easily. It was run this report to get a list of everyone that's got a profile, and then run a report that says, give me everyone that's in the system, and then do a comparison to say, well, who's in the system that doesn't have this value because they don't show up on this profile report. It's sort of an exception, kind of lookup, which I was disappointed to have to give that advice, but that's the only way I could figure out how to get, who's missing values type thing. So what's a better way to keep the profile up to date is actually attach it to something that you do on a regular basis with your employees, like performance reviews, annual or quarterly, for example. That's usually a good thing to add in to the review of how they're doing, then also reviewing the profile to make sure it's up to date, or that you agree upon the values that are in there in case you're doing things like expert, intermediate, and so forth. Other than that resource profile report, how do you know the last time it was reviewed? Well, actually there's nothing in the system that says when it was last reviewed. It just says when it was last updated. So I came up with an approach that I thought might work for some customers, and that is to actually use these user entity tags in the system and set up a tag group called Profile Reviewed and track it with an annual value or a monthly value, so at least you have some kind of mechanism to say when was the last thing reviewed and agreed upon. I set that user entity tag value, and I can keep a historical view of every time the profile was reviewed in the system. So what I did was I set up a tag group called Profile Reviewed, and then what it allowed me to do is actually leave a person with a blank value on Profile Reviewed, and then the first time that they get reviewed, the manager or the local administrator would update that user's demographic entity tag area and say, yes, we reviewed the profile together, we agree upon it, it's current as of August 2012. So then, 9 months from now, 12 months from now, somebody's looking up the data, they're finding, oh, look, Jimmy is an expert in, Jimmy is an expert in Motorola Android technology. But of course, a year from now, it's going to change quite a bit. So if you find out that the profile hasn't been reviewed in a year, it may be that he was an expert before version 75 came out, and that changed the world type thing. So it gives you additional information to be able to interpret the profile accuracy and validity of information. So I'm just going to show you that real quick, what I came up with. It's not the only way to do it, but it's a way that I think is helpful because by using the entity tags, something else is available automatically in the system, and I'll demonstrate that to you now. So the entity tags I'm talking about, it's this thing called tag groups. And when you have tag groups, I created one called Profile Reviewed, and the values are literally year and month. And you could set this to any list that you want, quarters, full years, whatever. And I also enabled it to be searchable tag group, which means the next topic we're going to talk about is how to use the data in the system, the profile data, and search is a great way to use the data in the system. So how can you take advantage of combining these tag groups with the information that you can search on? And then what I would do on the user record is I would just update the user entity to say when was the last time it was reviewed. I did one in August 2012, and a previous review was done back in December 2011. So I've got a tracker of every time that I reviewed the information. How is that helpful? When I go to start doing searches, and I'm sort of jumping the gun here on the next topic, but when I go to do searches, I can say, I can just do a quick audit to say when was the last time everyone's profile was reviewed. So that's step one. That's useful. Or I can say I'm going to look up everyone that has NetSuite OpenAir experience. When was the last time the profile was reviewed? So even though somebody may be tagged as an expert, everyone on this call at least knows that every 6 to 8 weeks there's new features. So 2 years from now you may not be as much of an expert as you were, simply because major changes could have come out. So if the profile hasn't been reviewed in quite a while, then maybe you would want to pick somebody who has a more recent review and to use on your project. The other thing is when to update is when you're using things like a passport where you're using a current and expired. OpenAir doesn't have natural logic to say, oh, I hit August 17th, 2012. I'm going to flip this flag from current to expired now on your passport. That's all manually maintained, and why many customers choose not to use OpenAir to track that kind of information, because there are systems on the market that do that automated switchover in many cases, and those are more HR tracker type systems than the OpenAir system. So if you do have something that's set up that would have some kind of current expired type thing like passports, right? On this passport one, I have an attribute that says whether it's current or expired. But if I pick current, then I want to quickly look down the comments to see, is the current actually current, or has it expired because, according to my notes, it was expired back in last month, for example. So this would give you a way to audit the information and find out if it's actually correct or not. So the last topic is where can the data be used? Obviously the main use of the data is for scheduling, finding resources that have the right skill sets, and fulfilling resource needs and schedule requests from within or outside of your department to enhance utilization. And that's where these search capabilities come into play. There's two types of searches automatically in OpenAir. There's a quick search and a custom search. Okay. But then the other question may be, well, can I just run a report? And unfortunately, the answer is no. You can run that resource profiles report. It shows you the last time things were updated and what the current values are for people if you want to do that. You do have the ability to do some filtering on that to say looking at certain people or looking at certain skill sets and pulling everyone that has that skill set. But that's pretty much the limit of what you can do. Otherwise, you're looking at individual lookups. And the resource profile report, as you saw, when I run it, it just gives me a dump of data. I can't sort of click in and drill through to see information about, well, what does that person's whole profile look like? I would have to rerun the report. Okay. So the search is really the best way to use the information in the system. The quick search is just that. It's a quick search. It gives you a single profile category that you can select, and then you can decide if you want to down select it by attribute or values or whatever it is, just to quickly down select to the group of people that are probably candidates that have that expertise. Okay. So let's go back to this system here where if I said for systems, I need to know anyone that has Great Plains experience, and look, Peter May has some Great Plains experience. What about Zendesk? Oh, yeah, look, everyone's got some Zendesk expertise in the system. It's just a matter of what is their level of expertise. So I can customize my view to say what is the attribute that describes that. And here, everyone's pretty much intermediate except for Peter May, which is an expert. So he may be my first person that I would want to go to see about using them on my project. Otherwise, I may just go to my next best option type thing. And the quick search really is just one-by-one values. And you can customize your view, as I just showed you, so you can bring in things like user entity tags. I have another user entity tag in the system that lets me know where that person lives in the U.S. So, if I'm finding an opportunity in Washington State and I need someone who's good at Zendesk, then, this person is an expert in California. That might be a better option for me. If it happens to be in New York, then, perhaps I can deal with the intermediate person in Virginia instead. Okay. The custom search actually allows you to combine stuff, and it's more than just combining skill sets. It's also considering things like, are you even available if you're doing bookings as your resource management approach. And also because OpenAir, just inherently as you put timesheets in the system or you schedule people to do work, there's a relationship between you, the project name, and the customer of that project. And so therefore OpenAir has all of that in the database, and the custom search allows you to tap into that to say, have you ever worked on Morgan Stanley, for example, or you're looking for somebody who has financial industry expertise, but it's not so much the financial that you want to know. You want to know if they've worked with Morgan Stanley before, and if they have, it would be great to grab them and put them on the project because they may already have contacts internally that could help you, win the deal, for example. So, but of course, that's only going to be as good as the information you have in the system. So All the data that you migrate into the system when you first get there, that's all available for searching through on historical information. All of the information you're putting in today gives you that ability. So if I show you what the custom search looks like, you can see right away that it's a lot more complicated than the quick search because it gives you the ability to mix and match. Okay, so I can mix and match all of those, those different skill sets or profile categories. And if you look at the selection values, I can say just give me everyone that knows something about education, or I can specifically say I only want the experts. Give me only the experts. Okay. The user entity tag, if I'm using things like, the last thing that was reviewed, or location, where people are for Virginia, I could put, the effective date in here. But the better one is this availability. So you can say, I only want people who have some availability during the next 2 weeks because we're doing a big sales engagement and I need to make sure that that person would be available. So you can identify very similar concepts to the bookings here. And you can say, like here, between March 4th and March 9th, I need that person to be available 20% of the time. If I check this box here, that means they need to be available 20% of the time contiguously between the 4th and the 9th. I can't have one day the person's not available, but overall they're available 20% of the time. So that, that allows you to say that I really need this person dedicated to the project. So I'm going to turn that off right now. And here's that experience area. So it can say, based on what you've put in timesheets already, I need to make sure I find out people who have experience with, customer Are You Smart, or a series of customers that are all sort of in the same industry. And that way you can pull based on the information that's gathered natively by OpenAir to get the information of who's going to be available. And then, of course, I can add things like I just want the regular people in the organization, or I want inactive people. So maybe there's a contractor that you've set a profile up in the system so that you can always search, and if you need to hire that contractor, you can go through and bring them back on board. So if I do this search, it comes back, and what it comes back with is it tells me how many different items actually matched based on my mix and match request. And here, these first 3 people, 3 of the items matched that I had selected. This person, everything matched, and the other 2 people, 50-50. They got 50% of it matched. So the nice thing is when that comes up, then you can sort of see, well, I definitely want to go look at Peter May and see what his availability is. And if you click into his name, then you'd be able to see the bookings, if you're using bookings, and see if the person's available for work or not. One thing I missed showing is when we were doing the custom search, if you click on the person's name, actually it brings you to the entire profile. And that's not available in the custom search, unfortunately. So the fact that I clicked on his name, brought me over to the bookings. But if I do a quick search and come up with the people, if I click on the user ID, it brings me into the profile of the person. So the search drill through is slightly different between which search you use. I like the quick search because it's a quick and easy thing, but the custom search does definitely give you a refinement of information when you're looking at people. So the data, the one thing, if you're giving people access to look up profiles in the system, you also have to consider who they're able to see in the resources module. So, if you're limiting people that you can only see the people that are on your project or that are in your office, the search criteria will only search across the people that you can see. So think about how you've set your filter sets up or your data access control based on the need to use the profile in the system, because you may decide that you want to expand the visibility of people in the organization. There's also OpenAir roles. These are the things that give people permission to do certain things in the system. The roles give you sort of a view and modify control option for the different profile categories. View industries, view products, view systems, things like that. But if you turn that off, what it does is it doesn't prevent the person from being able to set up their profile and view the list of skills or something. what it prevents them to do is actually go to the administration module and see the list there. So the OpenAir role, if you've set up a profile category, everyone has access to set up the profile category for their user. Everyone can set up the same, can access the same information in the profile database to set up their profile. Really the only control that the role has is whether you can only see yourself as a profile or you can see other people as a profile. And if you can see other people, are you allowed to modify those other people? So if I show you what the OpenAir role looks like, it may make a little bit more sense. So you have the view and modify profiles, which means everyone, and view and modify my own. So typically people have the view my own. If you have central control over what people are putting in, then maybe they can only view their own. But sometimes, most times I see people allowing individuals to update their own profile, but they can view others. They just can't modify other people's profile. But one thing that I would encourage people to avoid is trying to make a skill profile exactly like a resume and being able just to download that information and throw it into something like a proposal. Okay, it is very much an Excel type feel. It's types of skills plus some kind of descriptor or attribute. If you want more of a resume type feel, load up a resume, and I would recommend doing that through something called a workspace. Create a workspace that's dedicated to hold a copy of everyone's resume in the system, and then you can use things like the content searching, index searching available in OpenAir to find resumes based on keywords that may not be specifically in your skill database. So an example here is, I have a workspace over here. That's my resume workspace. Everything that's in here are the resumes in some certain format for my team. And if I want to do a search, I can do a full context search to say, give me everyone that's PMP. And based on that, I get something back. Now, you can actually control who can see this resume by using the members option and selecting the people that are in your organization, giving them the ability to just read it or not be able to access it at all. And right now, the only people that can access this is the owner, which happens to be me. I don't have anyone else having the ability to even look at the workspace resume area. So I'm going to open up the phone lines for questions, but while I'm doing that, just to summarize, the profile categories that you define, it doesn't have to be standard for industry. It should be standard for what you need to look up in the business. In my example here, I actually put OpenAir as a system. Does my team have experience with OpenAir? Well, yeah, we have to be. That's what my business is all about. So I really didn't need to put that into the profile database. I'll never search on that because I know everyone that I hire has to have experience already, and they have to be an expert. So, identify profile categories that make sense, that you'll search on them, that they're necessary to be searched on. Keep things simple. Don't try to go down to product versions. Keep it so that it's the information that you need to find in the organization. If everyone can speak English and you only deal with English, don't track languages. You don't really need that area. Don't get too detailed. Don't try to fill in the gaps of here's all the possible values in the world that you could pick from, because if you don't need those in the business, then limit the information that you have to pick out from so you only have the critical pieces for your profile. Okay. Wherever possible, use objective terms unless you have some type of review process in place where the subjective terms are validated. And the key to making a profile usable in the system is keeping it up to date. So definitely, the system doesn't do it for you. You have to define a process in some way to ensure that the data is actually being reviewed on a regular basis and updated on a regular basis. Otherwise, the initial setup that you do will just sit there and get old and not be used by anyone. If you have any more questions, definitely submit them into the OpenAir users community or contact TopStep directly. info@topstepconsulting.com comes to me. And as always, I just want to remind everyone we do have this ebook out there with all of our weekly tips that you are more than welcome to grab. And all of these webinars are free and recorded and posted on the website, which I'm hoping to get much quicker than I did the last one, which was the calendar one. That's still not up there, but I should get that up there, and this one up there by the end of this week. So thanks very much for attending, everyone. I do appreciate the support, and looking forward to talking to you next time.
Thank you.